So hello and welcome to the next A-level video from Mr. Gill's Science Stuff. Before you start this one, please make sure you go back and watch the previous video on diversity in the UK and around the world, because we're going to cover very quickly a lot of the same topics that were covered in that video. And if you don't know what we're talking about, then you need to go back and look at them. So, this is the part of syllabus we're working our way through. We're especially focusing on the bit highlighted in yellow at the bottom, the balance between human uses of land and environment, particularly agriculture, and conservation, the need for conservation. Okay, all the stuff above there we have already done and covered in previous videos. So, in terms of conservation, what do we mean? What is it? Well, it's the concept of preservation or maintenance of an environment. So we're talking about sustainable management, sustainable uses of resources, and this is taken directly from a mark scheme as to what you should be talking about. By sustainability, what we mean there is the use of resources but still preserving them for future generations. Because obviously we've got to use resources, but we don't want to be taking them away for the use of future generations. So, here's our objectives. We're going to describe the impact of agriculture on species diversity in broad terms, explain the balance between conservation and farming, and then look at some methods of effective conservation just as examples, because that kind of general line on your syllabus essentially means that the exam board can ask you pretty much any conservation or agricultural question, frame it in any example that they can find. So I'm going to give you a few examples, some of which we've touched on in previous videos. Okay, so we've talked about rainforests before, briefly in the last video. This is a typical example of what happens when you turn a wild habitat into an agricultural environment. Okay, so we've got tropical rainforests, very, very complex. If you studied any geography, you might know about what's called strata. So you might know that there's lots of different areas in a rainforest. There's the canopy, there's the subcanopy, there's the understory, there's the ground layer, right? And obviously then there's lots of other plants that grow on other plants called epiphytes, and so on and so forth. So you can see that's an incredibly diverse environment, right? With lots of different places, so-called niches for organisms to live, lots of variety of food sources, as we've discussed before. And I'm sure I've shown you before, the same video, that's a savo tree. It's one of the big sort of structural trees in the forests of South America, okay, and they are incredibly diverse environments. Okay, so once you take that away and turn it into an agricultural environment, then it looks like this. This is an enormous cornfield, as you can see, which has got huge, almost wheat field rather. It's got huge areas, production for food for humans, which obviously leads to a very, very low biodiversity. It's a monoculture, as we discussed in the last video. So, how can we manage this? How can agriculture manage its sort of relationship with conservation? Now, I really, really don't want to give you the idea, that agriculture bad, conservation good, because if you go and talk to people who actually are in agriculture and in farming, there's no group of people who actually are more aware of land use and the way the land is looked after than people who work in agriculture. They don't want to damage the environment any more than anybody else, but also they've got to provide you with the food that you eat. So, we've got grassland here as an example. We've got two different methods for so-called managing grassland. You've got the grazing on the top there, so you've got your cows grazing. They're going to be producing lots of milk for dairy, and then of course you've got wildflowers down at the bottom. Now of course the wildflower meadow is far more biodiverse, but it's a lot less productive in terms of agriculture. Maybe you get honey off that, you've got a lot of bees in the area, right? But it's far less diverse. So those two pictures really illustrate what we're talking about the balance between conservation and agriculture. So, last time we talked about hedgerows. Right, we talked briefly that hedgerows were incredibly good for biodiversity, and we talked about why we remove them. So you should remember why it is that we have been removing hedgerows for years and years and years. Okay, hedgerows are obviously great, but they do make fields smaller. Okay, they do make fields a lot smaller, so they make them harder to work. But they do a lot of useful stuff, like they are habitat, they provide food, they stop erosion, so on and so forth. Okay, for more on that, look back to the last video. Same with this point here about in terms of connectivity. We talked about fragmentation last time, which is the idea where you've got a wild habitat that you break up into little fragments. The sort of measurement we use there is the connectivity of the ecosystem. So on the left there you've got a low connectivity environment, and on the right a high connectivity environment. And as we discussed, it's much better for to have high connectivity, especially for larger animals that need large ranges to find enough food and to successfully mate. Okay, so there's various methods of doing this which we didn't discuss in the last topic. You can obviously leave the environment alone and not chop it down. That's obviously the ideal if it's possible. But if you want to restore conservation, we've got the planting of biodiversity corridors, so the planting of new forest that connects up to two areas of forest there, and that at the bottom is what's called a wildlife bridge, which allows wildlife to move across from one area to the other. Okay, and this was particularly well used in America, where they found that populations of puma were being massively split up by highways, and as such their individual gene pools were very, very small, and they were showing weird abnormalities due to very close breeding. The solution was to build a load of bridges over the highways so the puma could move and they could mix and they could spread out that gene pool, right, which has worked extremely well. You've also got planted forests here, and certainly selective felling if you have to fell the forest at all. Okay, so that's about one method of conservation. So the question that sort of we never really address at the beginning of conservation topics is, why are we bothering? Who cares? Right? Why do we bother? Right? Stupid panda, if it can't look after itself, let it go extinct. What's the problem? Chop down the rainforest. Why do we need it? Right? It's just full of bitey, stingy things. Get rid of it. So what's the reason? And this is a question you can be asked. What's the motivation behind conservation? Why should we bother trying to preserve ecosystems? Because so far in this topic, we've just made the assumption that we should. Okay? So there's a number of answers you can give here. There's a number of schools of thought. First one is pretty obvious. It's ethical. It's the biodiversity is our responsibility. The idea that why should we have access to an environment that future generations don't? Why should we deprive future generations of something we've got just to make our life a bit more comfortable? Okay, that's the ethical argument. There's of course the economics. Now, I don't like to reduce ecosystems and conservation to economics, but it does seem to be the way the world runs, which is quite unfortunate. So you've got tourism, biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, etc. So all of the monetizable things that these wild ecosystems give us. Okay, we also refer to those as ecosystem services. We'll come to that in a little bit. You've then got cultural and aesthetics. So obviously habitats have got significance to populations. Now, if you've ever lived in different areas or been to different areas, you will know that a lot of human culture is wrapped up in the environment that they live in. So basically habitats have significance to populations, right? And also they look pretty. So you can think about that in terms of the UK. Would Keats have written his great works if he hadn't had the rolling hills of the South Downs, or various other writers? Would Shakespeare have written what he'd written if he hadn't grown up in Warwickshire with the countryside around him in the UK? We don't know. So the point being, there is a cultural link between us as humans and our environments, which is a good argument for looking after them. Okay, ecosystem services is a term you're hearing more and more these days in terms of how much would it cost, or would it be possible to do the things that the environment does for us. Things like flood prevention, drug providing, mental health support, recreation, so on and so forth. Okay, those are all what we call ecosystem services, and you can actually put something of a rough monetary value on a wild habitat, which is now part of the planning process if there ever needs to be anything chopped down or built through. So HS2, for example, will be looking into what the ecosystems actually provide. Those are very bad at measuring the ethical and the cultural sides, though. You can't really put a monetary value to that, and I don't think really you should be trying. So this goes round quite often, right, which I think I agree with. Obviously, imagine if trees gave off Wi-Fi signals because we can put money to those. Unfortunately, they just produce the air we breathe. So that's the sort of why we're doing conservation. To give you a couple of specific examples, this is a plant called a Madagascar periwinkle, surprisingly enough, found in Madagascar, and it is one of the most sort of rich sources of pharmaceutical substances that are useful to us that we found, and it's found in Madagascar forests. Had those forests been destroyed before we'd found it, we wouldn't have some of the most powerful anti-cancer drugs that we've got, for example. One from a little closer to home. This is a willow tree. Now, some of you may already know, if you've done this in A-level chemistry, that willow trees in their bark produce a thing called salicylic acid, and salicylic acid is the sort of precursor molecule for aspirin, right? One of the most common painkillers you can get. So if we chop them all down, we don't have any aspirin. So What do we do about it now? So we know we've done some bad things around the world. How do we sort that out? Okay. Well, putting things back, seeing a dwindling ecosystem and literally restoring it, quite labour intensive. We call that restoration ecology. Okay. So putting the hedges back from where they've been pulled up. Wetland restoration projects, so allowing bits of area to flood and go back to being natural wetlands rather than trying to drain them for farmland, for example. This is what we call restoration ecology. Now, getting people into the environment to physically put plants back and physically dig things out and do that is expensive and it's time consuming. So there are some common methods that have been used for a very, very, very long time of managing environments that don't require human intervention. One is grazing, so you use domestic animals to keep new growth at a particular level, and use different animals to graze to a different level, and the other is burning, controlled burning. And I'm going to give you a couple of case studies to look at that. So, for one, the New Forest. Now, this is the reason I picked this example is this is my home. This is where I was born and raised, and it is an area that's been conserved since 1066, and the councils that were set up to do this, the so-called agisters and verderers, have been there, since that time. Obviously, different people, not the same people. Although, if you meet some of them, you'd be surprised. So, this is a method of conservation that goes on, which, if you ever want to go and see quite a wild spectacle of old British conservation, this is one to go and see. It's called the drift. Okay, it happens on around August Bank Holiday. If you are what's called a commoner in the New Forest, which means you have commoners' rights, to achieve this you need to be of a certain family or own a certain property that was an original property. You're allowed to release horses, the famous New Forest pony, onto the forest. And what they do is they graze the forest. So they stop the overgrowth of things like gorse, and they stop forests encroaching into open land, and it keeps a variety of land. Every August, it's also then your responsibility to go and help round them up, measure them, check them, see if they've had any foals, count the foals, that kind of thing. And obviously, if we want the forest to be grazed down a little bit more, then they release all of the new foals and all of the colts, all the males, back onto the forest. If we want the forest to be grazed a little bit less, so we want the number of ponies to go down a bit, then as they're counted through these big sort of corrals that are created, then they take some of the colts away and they are used elsewhere, and we'll not go into that. So, to show you what this means, I'm going to give you a little video that I took from when I went home a couple of years ago to watch this, happened to be home, if you're not used to it, not hearing it, you'll be hearing some of my native accent, which I'm sure some of you know is like that. That's down Hampshire, that's where I'm from, but I never had that accent. So you'll hear some of the wonderful locals, and this is a 1,000-year-old conservation method in action in the New Forest drift.
Oh, look, come on!
Get out of the way, riders! There's riders down there. Ah! 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 Our Indians. Don't let it go! Don't let it go! What's that one?
Oh no!
Look. Look, I ain't want to go over there. You got me? You stay down there in the gap. when the horse was
He's crying.
Okay, that's plenty enough of that. So I hope you enjoyed that. That is a method of conservation that's been going on for literally 1,000 years. And the guy with the stick there is a village famous local person named Wilfie, who's a wonderful man who has the farm down the road from where that video was taken. So, moving on. Another conservation method from the New Forest, of course, if you're putting horses out there, those of you who keep horses might know that acorns are highly poisonous to them. So if you went down to the New Forest in October half term, you might see pigs that have been released onto the forest to eat all of the acorns so they don't poison the horses. Okay, this is another conservation and management method. Now, you might also know what this is. This is gorse. Now, gorse is a really good plant for lots and lots of niches, biodiversity, but as you're probably aware, if it gets too big and too old, it becomes woody, becomes spiky, and it's not particularly useful. So another conservation method, so that was grazing, this is burning. Okay, so amounts of the new forest, depending on the year and what we'll need to do, are burned every year, so you get controlled burns in the summer, which basically get rid of the old gorse and allow new gorse to come through, and this is a conservation tactic used the world over. So, in terms of conservation in generally, why do people damage their environments? And obviously the New Forest is fairly well managed, it has been, but that's ultimately because we live in a fairly wealthy country, and the whole New Forest was invented to be a recreational leisure area for William the Conqueror. It was his hunting ground, which is why it was established in that way. Not everywhere in the world enjoys that sort of privilege. So, main one I've noticed, and it seems obvious, but it's really obvious if you actually go and see this, is poverty, is desperation, is education, is opportunity. We mentioned this in the last video. So, what do you actually do about this? Because you can't turn up to this environment and say, no, you people there, you shouldn't be chopping down your forest, you shouldn't be doing that to your ecosystem, because what else are they supposed to do? So, you've got to give them an incentive. You've got to effectively protect an environment by making people not want to damage their environment. Right? It's all well and good turning up to look after rhinos with a big rifle and guarding them and all that kind of stuff, but if the people still want to poach them because they're earning a huge amount of money for their horns, for example, then they're still going to take that chance. So you provide education, you need to provide opportunity, and this is especially keen for women, and there's lots of good statistical analysis and good research onto if you enable women to take more control over their education, their reproduction the world over, then you raise the economic output of the area, and you basically raise the wealth of the area, and you in turn stop the damaging of the environment. It's a very effective conservation strategy. Okay, so raising wealth. So what positive actions are taken? Some examples of good conservation. Well, things called red carbon credits are basically countries that produce a lot of carbon into the atmosphere pay countries that have a lot of forest not to chop them down, in a bit of offsetting about that. I suggest you go and read up on red carbon credits. I'll put a link in the description. You've got ecotourism, which is where you go with a company specifically intending to do travel in an eco-friendly way. Maybe you're doing something while you're out there. A lot of the school expeditions would count as ecotourism. You've got land purchase and nature reserves, of course, so the idea of protecting little bits of the land or the coast or whatever it is and making them into nature reserves. There's funding issues with that. And then how do you enforce them? How do you pay for enforcement? Okay, this is the question. So I'll give you an example on the other end of the spectrum, from the New Forest, which is in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, to Madagascar. Now, I mentioned my friend Armand in the last video, and who helped us a successful guide for us, but this is a little bit more on this particular case study. So why is it important? Why did we go there in the first place? Well, it's got endemism, which is a key word, high levels of endemism, which essentially means organisms that are found there and nowhere else on the world. So there's a quote from the World Wildlife Fund on Madagascar in 2011 that 600 new plants and animals were discovered in Madagascar between 1999 and 2010. Many of them were already at point of discovery in danger of extinction. So it's obviously a very important conservation priority. So to give you an example, our first moment walking into the camp, there's lemurs in the trees, right, just there to look at us. We've got these incredibly diverse water systems, freshwater systems as well. Right, fruit that you've never seen. This is called a makutra. It's a very weird thing. It's like a small coconut that tastes like rhubarb and custard with lots and lots of seeds on the inside. You've got lizards, okay, all sorts of different hepatofauna, and indeed new ones. This was a species that was not thought to exist in this area, and this is the first example that was found in that area after a day of hiking up and down a river. Okay, so it's really, really important. But that sort of area, with all the lemurs and the lizards, is in the minority now. Right, that over 90% of Madagascar has been deforested and now looks like this. So it should look like dry forest. Right, it should look like the pictures I've just shown you, but actually it looks like that, and most people live in situations like this, okay, which is not good. So you can see these guys are going to basically want to do anything they can to make some money. Okay, This obviously is one effect of that is that all the topsoil is running into the rivers, and if you look at satellite pictures of Madagascar with all the topsoil running into the Indian Ocean, I've seen them captioned with the statement that Madagascar is effectively bleeding. And that's what it looks like. So really, really important place to conserve, right? So what does conservation look like? What do we do? How do we fix this? Well, again, we're not going to go into that too much because there's another conservation lesson after exam season. So I would recommend having a look at this organisation, Operation Wallacea, who, as I mentioned last time, are the organisation that we go travelling with, and basically being aware, being involved, getting out there, using your money and using your privileged position as a British citizen, essentially, to do good work in the world. And that basically doesn't matter whether it's in a reef in Cuba, right, whether it's in dry forests of Madagascar, whether it's in the Amazon rainforest, or whether it's on the reefs of Fiji, the same thing is true. So, by the end of this, you should be able to do the following things. Right, you should be able to give examples of human activities in reducing diversity. You should be able to answer the question, what does an increasing human population need, i.e. why are we damaging our environments in the first place, and then reasons for conserving ecosystems and habitats, so why should we look after some of it, and then give examples of ways we can sustainably exploit the environment whilst providing for all of our needs. Okay, and I can't be any more specific about what you're going to get in an exam on conservation because it could be literally any example, but I hope that gives you a rough idea of the kind of thing that you could end up with. Okay, see you next time.